Australian BPD network and the MHPN for having me here. It's certainly a fantastic opportunity to just talk about BPD and families and BPD with so many of you here. When I started taking an interest in this field, there weren't so many events like we have now, and so many foundations and people working towards this cause, but it's fantastic that it is happening and that you're meeting regularly just to think about BPD. So what are we going to do today? These are the topics we'll cover. And as you'll see, I won't start immediately with understanding families and friends of a person with BPD, because there are some other issues I want to raise about advocacy, the agencies you all work in, and so on. Could I please have a show of hands of how many of you work in public mental health? 1, 2, 3, that's it? Okay, how many in NGOs?
Oh, sorry, that's me.
Yeah. How many working in, what are some other, private practice? Quite a few. What have we left out?
I mean public health, but not mental health.
No.
Public health,
But
okay.
not mental health.
Okay, fair enough, yeah, good, because there are a lot of people and families out there who are represented. Anyone else we left out? Yes?
Private hospitals?
Private hospitals, yes, and they offer fantastic programs for people who have private health cover. So that gives me a bit of an idea where you come from. So in terms of agencies that we work in, often you will be working in agencies, for example in mental health, where there are policies and mission statements about being inclusive, and that should definitely include people with BPD and providing support to their families, and it does on paper, but it doesn't always happen in practice. Or you might be working in an agency where the actual mission of the agency is not to provide services to this group, but you will find, because people are people and because the prevalence of BPD and trauma is high in the general population, you'll get this population as well. But it doesn't necessarily dovetail with the mission of your agency and what you're supposed to be doing with your day. So I'm mentioning this because working with people with BPD and their families, it's really important that whatever we do should be resting on good foundation. And if there is some kind of conflict between the agency's goals and mission and goals, I suppose I should say, and between what you actually start doing with families, sometimes the families can suffer. So it's good to have clarity, but also it's good to notice when there is that conflict and perhaps alert people who can make decisions about this and hopefully provide more services to the fact that actually this is an area that you need to do lots of work in because the demand is there. Often the agencies you're in would be underfunded and overrun. And yes, there is a lot of talk about this, and it is all true. And having worked in mental health, I know it's really, really hard. And at the same time, we need to do what we can because it's not all about money. And I'm sure you're doing lots of good work with families. And it's not because this is what you're supposed to do, but because this is what's needed and wanted, and this is what makes sense at the time. There are national guidelines. I don't know how many of you realize that, those of you who work in organizations rather than in private practice, that there are now clinical practice guidelines for the management of borderline personality disorder. In these guidelines by the MHPN, there's lots said about families as well.
Excuse me, there's a couple of copies out there that people are welcome to take if they like.
Good. And I have some version of it as well that I can send out to people if they want it. So there's a lot said about supporting families and carers in the guidelines as well. So the one thing we can do is to know that actually this is legitimate work, and it is actually in the guidelines. It doesn't always happen, of course. And also there's a lot written about trauma-informed care, and I know Behaviour has done a lot in this in this area. And there are lots, so obviously Behaviour would be one place to turn to if you wanted your organization to have some kind of in-house training. Would that be possible? Yeah, in-house training about trauma-informed care. Lighthouse is another organization that does this kind of work. Now, the last one, the National BPD Training and BPD Strategy. It's a paper, is it?
Yes,
that's the one you were mentioning.
That's the one I've invited people to the launch of.
Yes, and I included that because the email with the invitation came to me today. So I thought I mentioned that too, that actually we as professionals are not that flash with skills and training. I'm always the first one to admit that when I was trained in clinical psychology, I've got a master's degree in clinical psychology, but I learned nothing about BPD. So I've learned all of what I know on the job, and taking time to go to events like this and conferences, reading books and so on. I read Marshall Linehan's book on dialectical behaviour therapy before there was any training anywhere in Australia. We just had access to the book, and actually it was quite a good read, and we could do quite a bit with it. So the training is really important, because often you will find yourself needing to do jobs that you have not had training for or haven't really got clear ideas. And of course, like me, you can learn on the job, but it's a hard way of doing it. If you can get more training, that will be very good. So more on the agencies we work in. I have, as a senior staff member in mental health in the last few years before I retired from it, I always kept an eye on, okay, what's in the policy, what's in the guidelines, and are we following it? For example, at admission or in the emergency department, are people following what's in the guidelines? Because there's some good stuff in the guidelines. And of course, it's worth looking for exclusions, worth looking for examples of punitiveness, remarks made on the side. I quote them asides here. Another thing that I was always very aware of at Northern in the last 11 years before I retired was that it's an area with a lot of cult, do you say cult? Yeah, called population. And so do the statistics of the mental health area and the statistics we have in mental health actually tally with each other? Or do we service more people who maybe the staff might be more comfortable with, and certain other people are somehow not represented in the numbers that they could be represented in? So it's something to keep an eye out for. So this is more about professional development. In a kind of bottom-up approach. So from a level that you're working on, which I assume would be, the bulk would be kind of in fairly, in social work 2 and 3 and psychology 2 and 3 positions and whatever other positions you're in. But we can make some changes through asking for certain things that we know are needed. And so in your agency, why not ask for professional development activities on what is BPD, what are the effective treatments for BPD, how do we determine that? At Northern, we had a lot of, it was an uphill battle to introduce anything into actually direct services that you could call effective treatment for BPD. And yet, people with BPD and their families were represented hugely in our client population and family population. Other topics might be practitioner self-care and mindfulness. And it's actually one of the topics for MHPN to do in the future. I'm not sure if it's being planned already or not. Other people call it training in calm, because one thing with BPD-related work is that keeping calm and achieving calmness when you are sailing in stormy waters is a #1 priority for families as well as people with BPD. Self-compassion, you mentioned, Julianne, it's something that we need to think about and understand more. And we shouldn't forget CBT, because CBT seems to kind of waxen wane a bit over the decades, but it has some good things to offer to families as well as to people with BPD. Now, what about us helping professionals? We are a part of our society. Our society has prejudices, and we as mental health professionals sometimes reflect some of those prejudices, and of course it can come into our work. And so we need to be aware of that. And when we notice some kind of bias, let's say against people with trauma, working with people with trauma background or families with trauma background, when we notice it, it's important to speak up about that. If it seems like the right and appropriate kind of environment for speaking up about it. When I worked at St. Vincent's, we gave a survey to staff which basically focused on their attitudes towards people with trauma and BPD. And we found that there were 2 camps, and the 2 camps were split down the middle. The one group was staff who said, yes, we need to do everything for this population, and we need to support them to the maximum, and we need to understand them and kind of do everything possible. And the other side was, this population needs to pull up their socks and get on with life and not bludge on Centrelink benefits. It mightn't even have been called Centrelink then. And just get on with it and not use up good resources that are meant for people with real mental illnesses. And I don't know if some of you are in my age group. We heard a lot about that even 20 years ago. Even 20 years ago. So yeah. So when we sit in meetings in our agencies, it's good to keep an ear out and an eye out for these sorts of things. There is very little talk in our helping professions about the fact that we as helping professionals also have experiences in our growing up years, developmental experiences we could call it, and then our attachment styles that come out of that can predispose us for certain roles. For roles such as helping, fixing, rescuing, lecturing, punishing, being a bit chaotic, and so on. And there's nothing wrong with any of this, provided we are aware of it, provided we know that we bring it to our workplace, provided we know that we can bring it to working with families and a population where there is a lot of this anyway, and we might need to be more aware with working with this population because we can make things worse. It is possible to make things worse, and we all want to make things better rather than worse.
Sorry, Anna, do you want questions now or at the end, or how's that?
Okay, yeah, anytime. Have you got a question?
Sorry, Bradley Drew's my name. I'm actually here representing my wife who couldn't get here tonight, so she's the professional counsellor. I'm just the husband of a parent of a son with BPD. In reference to the professionals before, where you had the two groups, that was really enlightening, and I think it's really prevalent.
I think it's very typical of helping
very much so, and I guess as a parent with a son with BPD, we've certainly seen that in our family group. What sort of outcomes, were there outcomes that took place because of what was identified, and what were some of the things, what were some of the positive things that might have come out of what was identified?
Yeah, so this was a long time ago, probably 20 years ago that we did this at St. Vincent, and it was the first step towards starting to think as a hospital, as a service, about what's needed to provide a better service for people with trauma backgrounds. And we then started, it was around the time, Spectrum came into being, so we were thinking about how we can use Spectrum, what are the staff needs, what are the client needs and families' needs, and what we can do about it. And so we worked very closely with Spectrum and with a number of other people and organizations. And basically we decided the first step was then, after the survey, is to establish a BPD work group. And that work group's job was to improve services for clients, provide better support and other services to carers, and also to support staff with difficult work that none of us were really properly trained for. And I can probably say that quite openly. But we all needed training, and we all needed to think about how we're going to do this. So it was the beginning of something that took off a bit over the last 20 years. And now, in a lot of mental health services, there are work groups like that are looking into this area and supporting this work for staff. My job at Northern for the last 11 years before I retired, it's the Northern Area Mental Health Service, which covers kind of this area, Preston and right up to Epping, Northbrook right up to Epping. My job was BPD and complex care specialist, and my job was to support staff to do the hard work that they needed to do, and the hard thinking they needed to do about what else to do other than what they were doing. And very part-time and kind of small role, but at the same time it was very important that there was something like this. Northern was perhaps the only mental health service for most of those years that had somebody like that within their service, that they were paying me to support staff and think of providing better services for people like your son and you and your wife. Does that answer your question?
Sort of. I mean, it's a work in progress. It's
work in progress. That's
I think when you were introducing, I think that one of the key things that I picked up was that awareness. Getting our community aware of BPD. I think it's an area where there's a lot more work needs to be done. A lot more work. It's I don't like to hear the word reduced funding and that. I think we need to lobby and work hard in that space to increase whatever we can to help people that struggle with mental illness in general, not just BPD but in general. But
I think there is funding for this. Would you agree, Julianne, that there is funding for this area of work? as a result of the good work that a lot of people have done in the last...
Well, we've done this work for 6 years with no funding.
No funding, okay.
No funding.
No funding whatsoever.
Finally, we've got, this year is the first time we've really achieved any funding, and for that project that we're going to launch in the first week, which is training for mental health professionals via a series of webinars supporting networks like this around Australia. The National Mental Health Commission provided some funding for that project. That's the first serious bit of funding, well, it's the first real funding we've had. For the BPD Awareness Week, we managed to get a bit of sponsorship from Project Air, from Spectrum, Mind Australia and Me My National, and that funding enabled us to employ a PR firm, public relations firm, and a social media firm with a very small amount of funding as those sort of organisations go. But that's enabled us really to raise the bar a bit for BPD Awareness Week, and it's helping us to circulate, or to encourage people to run activities. We've got one activity going in, I think, nearly every state of Australia. We're struggling with Northern Territory, but I'm hoping Queensland and Tasmania are coming on board, but the other states are. And the PR people can sort of push that, do media releases, etc. We've got Ian Hickey, who's a National Mental Health Commissioner and also a big mental health advocate from Brain Mind Institute. And he's actually we've been able to do a little video with him for the website. Through volunteer effort, we've created a BPD Awareness Week website. But basically, the work for 6 years has all been voluntary, and this year we have got a bit of money for the project. And if anyone's interested in helping us with this work, being part of our board or volunteering in any way to help, come and see me. Yeah.
Can I just jump in just quickly, because you wanted to get us done? I think one of the real issues also around, trying to get funding in a sense for this, what are we using it for? So we're trying to kind of develop activities, training, but I think one of the areas that are really lacking around this complex sort of trauma, BPD sort of situation is some serious sort of research, particularly not so much, there's quite a bit of research in neuroscience and the sort of medical side of it, but there's very little research on implementation sort of projects. So how do we get services to do this work? How does the service take up? Because there's plenty of evidence-based treatments and things like that. So we're really good on that, on the models of treatment and on the sort of the neuroscience, particularly of it now. But there's very little research on how do we get services to take up, how do we get even individual practitioners to take this up. I think that's a really big gap, and that funding is just nowhere really.
And the neuroscientists get funding because they're part of the research institute, and it's considered science. But those of us who do the clinical work with families and with people with BPD are clinicians, and we are not that well versed in research. But Peter, you're one of the people who has managed to do some research in this area. Do you want to mention, just in a nutshell, just what you've done there?
Well, not much actually.
Yeah, but you've done more than I think.
Well, not any sort of major research project, but just small scale sort of thing. Well, because I've been working with families, particularly around this issue, and I've run sort of workshops and projects with families for probably now, I don't know, 13 or 14 years. So
and you've been collecting data?
We've been collecting data on that. So what works, so what helps families, what's useful for them as far as this sort of kind of support. But I think really the idea of implementation is the issue, that we know a lot, but how do we implement that? How do we get services to take it up? How do we get individual practitioners
bring it to the shop front?
Yeah, absolutely.
And I think this event hopefully is one of those events when we're bringing it to some kind of forum that that's going to, hopefully you will each go back to your work and take some of the handouts and take some of the ideas we discuss, and it can spread that way. I'm not going to talk about what is borderline personality disorder, because I understand you've had input about that. And also, these days it's easy to read. All you have to do is go to the Spectrum website. It's Spectrum BPD. Is it .org.au or is it .com or something?
I think it's .com.
.com, okay. So Spectrum BPD is the Spectrum website, and they've got good information on what is BPD. There are books on what is BPD. One of the books was put out by Spectrum staff. Yes, they all work for Spectrum, and it's on their website. And there's also good information on. There are family guides, books that are called family guides. Here are two. One is called The Essential Family Guide to Borderline Personality Disorder, and the other one is Overcoming Borderline. Overcoming is a big word, mind you, but Overcoming Borderline Personality Disorder, Family Guide for Healing and Change. They're both American, and so is this one, which you would have heard about, and some people love to hate, because it's very American, but it has some good ideas in it, and some people love it.
There's actually a newer edition of that book.
Is there?
Which has been really, I think, it's been rewritten. It's actually much more practical and focused book.
Good,
yeah.
because this has had some criticism, but there were years when this is the only one we had, so it was better than nothing at all.
And that's actually a workbook which supplements the book.
The actual book,
yeah. So this is the workbook. I lost my book, I think. I went into someone. Yeah, so anyway, there is information available about what is BPD, but the topic of this talk tonight is the family experience, that BPD affects family, but also BPD can be, at least in part, caused by some kinds of family experience for some family members, along with other things, and certainly not the family sort of causing it single-handedly, but other things. And those other things might be temperamental vulnerabilities, neuropsychological vulnerabilities. What else? Many of those things. Environmental factors and organic factors. The diagnosis was first defined quite a while ago, and the DSM-5 kept the DSM-4's diagnosis, but it's in the process of changing. Our thinking is changing about what is the best way to diagnose it, what is the best way to understand it. People who have BPD and complex needs are often the ones who have comorbid diagnosis. And these are the people who will cause the most family distress. But for example, people who have alcohol and drug habits as well. I noticed some of you come from AOD services. Is there anyone here from alcohol and drug services? Right, okay, good. Because BPD often goes together with other diagnoses like depression and anxiety. The diagnosis of personality disorder is sometimes a relief, sometimes a punishment. In the past, people used to be excluded from services, as you mentioned, Julianne, when they had that diagnosis, because it was not considered a proper mental illness. Now, my opinion about whether we should give diagnosis out or not depends on whether it leads to more understanding, more compassion and effective treatment, and whether it leads to more support for the client but also their families. And I mentioned here again about the fact that family members often seek help about a member of the family who are not diagnosed. I think that there's sometimes a lot of pressure on us professionals to diagnose someone in their absence. It can be done. It can be done. But we can see the family about the distress and conflict and whatever else that they're dealing with, but we can't diagnose in people without people coming to see us. Another way to talk about, so let's say with families who come to us and their family member may or may not have BPD, but we can see for sure sometimes that they might have some troubles with emotion regulation, they might have some troubles with their relationships, they might be a bit impulsive, for example. So we can talk about the presenting issue, and it's sometimes also quite clear, the last one, shaky sense of self, that when we see a family and they talk about their family member with BPD, it's sometimes quite easy to see that actually the family member might be clutching at straws, not sure as to which way to turn, not sure as to where they really stand in life. So that's to do with the shaky sense of self. And they're all core features of borderline, but it's in DBT terms. I like the DBT terms because they also give clues as to what to do about these things. So for someone whose emotions roller coast and totally dysregulated and everyone is in danger of being swept off their feet who come close, a person like that needs emotion regulation. Relationship difficulties, yes, within the family, outside the family, relationship skills, and so on. I don't think I wanted to leave this bit out about the fact that people with complex PTSD, complex trauma, and BPD often report layers of traumatic experiences. A lot of studies report an average of 70%, but some report as high as 90% of people with BPD reporting childhood abuse and neglect experiences in their growing up years. But however, this is sometimes perpetrated inside the family and sometimes outside the family. Even if anything like this happened inside the family, not everybody in the family will know about it. And some members of the family you will be seeing, or we are all seeing, will not know anything about it. We also, if we see families with these kinds of presentations, we know and we will kind of learn that often in these families, if you do a genogram, how many of you here do genograms when you see families? Almost everyone. If you do a family genogram, there'll be the person with the current problem, let's say, and then there's a family, the immediate family around that person. And then up here in this generation, there'll be somebody who had some behaviors or some presentation in those decades. It may not have been called BPD, but it sounds like there may have been similar issues. And then, lo and behold, on the other side of the family, let's say you looked at the mother's side, you're looking at the father's side, there may be some dots as well of family members. So intergenerational trauma, there's a lot talked about that in the Jewish context, you know, the long shadow of the Holocaust. And I learned about this first through that, actually. And now I know that you don't have to be Jewish to have this. In fact, I have some of it in my own family. And if it's not trauma, clearly identified trauma, it might be some loss or disconnections, sometimes due to illness, sometimes due to actual mental illness, sometimes due to political and other events in the world. So the disconnections can be there for lots of reasons, and they affect us, and often they're a big part of the picture. And it's good for, let's say, the young person, like for your son, to understand that other people they share something with other people in their family, And hopefully they can understand that they can take this further and have a better life than perhaps they were able to have with all the supports we have now. Well, with more support we have now than before. And of course here we go, genetic, neurobiological and neurodevelopmental factors also get involved, like this is about how the brain works, and often it comes into areas like how people express anger, or how patient they are, or how easily upset they are. People with BPD type backgrounds often are quick to anger, quick to feel upset, and it takes a long time for them to settle down. It's just kind of not fair, is it? They're affected doubly. Whereas some of their siblings or other people in the family might be slow to get upset and quick to soothe. And yet that's kind of nice for them, but it's not fair for the other person who's got a double whammy. Quickly upset, quickly angered, and slow to soothe. So what do we mean by family? Of course, I just keep mentioning family tonight, but I mean everybody who supports someone with BPD. It could be, or maybe support or not support someone, but is around someone with BPD in their environment. Their own children, for example, or adult offspring of people parents who had BPD, grandparents, in-laws, friends, neighbors, school teachers, and so on. Okay. So this is where I would like you to kind of get us thinking about a few things. Obviously, you're coming here because you're seeing families. Is that right? And so I'd like you to just quickly tell me some things that your families come to you with. You know, the ones who representing my problem might be. What might be some of the presenting problems? Some of you may have expected me to start with this. How can we respond to family members' needs when they come through the door and they are feeling all of those or some of those things and some others? We can offer support, offer resources. We can we're perhaps in a position to teach new skills. We can liaise with other professionals. And if we can't do those things, because our agency is not meant for that, or we're full up, or for whatever reason we can't, it is very important to refer to appropriate agencies. Now, Rita has given me some pages of the website of Spectrum. Is that where this is from?
It's not actually off the website. Spectrum used to have a brochure.
Yeah.
And that's now out of date because there's been a number of changes to the way Spectrum, its mode of operation.
And
so,
a new telephone number too.
and Spectrum is moving towards the end of the year as well. So that is the brochure as an A4 document.
As an A4 document,
yeah.
Which you've given me, you emailed this to me.
Yeah.
And would people who are here tonight have access to this or not?
Not at this stage, because Spectrum's also in the process of updating its website.
Okay.
But if they send me an email, I'll put up my email address. I'm more than happy to email copies of pretty well everything that's out there.
So people need to send you an email?
Yeah.
Okay, so if you put your email address up there, that would be fantastic. So if you request this document, I'm suggesting that this is a very good one because the last page has a lot of, it's got two sections. For more information and support, there are lots of agencies listed, and there are helplines listed, including for children, the kids helpline and so on. So it's a very good one to have. But even if you look at the current website of Spectrum, you would find that there's quite a bit of information there for carers. I've used that a bit. Thanks, Rita. So if you email, you will get this. It's about 5 pages, I think.
Yeah.
It's got several pages anyway.
But also, I've just got some other things here, Anna. So one of my other hats is that I'm the carer consultant at Spectrum, with Spectrum, and one of my roles is to run workshops for family members for carers, which is predominantly led by a carer, me, and is predominantly being written by me. So rather than clinicians working out what they think carers want, it's actually by a carer for carers. So the next one is in November. I'm hoping to run one in December, but with some uncertainty, I'm not too sure whether that's going to happen.
So can I have a copy of that, please? Or do you have lots of copies or not?
That one? Yeah.
Thank you. Yeah. So learning more about BPD, a one-day workshop for families and friends. Fantastic. So it's actually learning about what it is, understanding about BPD, learning new ways to support the family member, developing and sustaining healthy relationships within the family and other social networks, creating a balance between caring for another and caring for yourself. Now there is a challenge. Connecting with other carers and feeling like you're not alone. Yeah, that sounds great. I'll leave it up here.
And the other one, which is actually where I first met Anna many years ago, she was the facilitator of a support group for carers that was run by ARAFEMI at the time, which is now part of Mind Australia. I've moved on from being a carer, really distressed carer, going along to...
This was BPD.
Yes,
Yeah.
BPD.
Yeah.
And now I co-facilitate that group with 2 other mental health clinicians. I've been notified by Ian Brooks, the family, the boss of the family part of Mind, that the offices in Rosanna will actually be closing in October. So the next group will be at Rosanna. However, I really suggest that if you give anyone this flyer, you ask them to ring the carer helpline, because I'm not too sure, and Ian doesn't know where the November group will be. So it's unfortunately a watch this space.
Yeah.
And the foundation has written a borderline BPD help tip for families and carers, and that's available on our website, or there's some copies out there. A number of you may have heard of the Family Connections program.
Yes,
So that's a program that's come out from the States. In the States, it's led by volunteers who have actually done the Family Connections program themselves as carers, and then gone on and done leadership training. Because we don't actually have the pool in Australia of people who have done the Family Connections program. It's basically open to anyone who's done the training to take on the leadership role. So groups are, when leaders get together and decide that they're ready to run the group, they will notify Family Connections, and Family Connections will then notify anyone on their list that there's a group starting. Are they interested in attending? So you need to register an expression of interest, which is on the page.
There's been one group in Preston, I think probably a year ago now.
Well, there's been one in Nunawading, a couple in South Melbourne, one I think in Brunswick. So they're different places. The other one which may be of interest to you as workers, understanding and treating people with a diagnosis of BPD. So this is a one-day workshop for mental health professionals which Spectrum runs a couple of times during the year.
So it's a foundation workshop dealing with the basics. What is BPD? What are effective treatments? How do you deal with splitting and other things?
Yeah. So I've actually attended, and I found it was very worthwhile. So all this information's out here.
Thanks, Rita. Thanks, Rita. So I was just going to mention the Family Connections workshop, which is the one that you need to register for. I've got the brochure here about it as well. And basically that program is worth knowing. So it's worth, what I want to say is that when we think of this population and the size of this population, we can't work with everyone. But if we know our resources, we can actually get quite a lot done by also referring people to appropriate agencies, not just to anyone, like talk to your GP and the GP will refer them to the counsellor who works in his office, sort of thing. But the support that people with this kind of problems need, these kinds of problems need, is BPD friendly or trauma-informed support and trauma-informed care. And that's not as easy to find as support and care, generally. Yes?
I've just noticed on some of the information, the Blue Knot hasn't been mentioned. Well, adult survivors of child abuse, it used to be known as.
Okay.
And Blue Knot is very about trauma-informed.
Okay.
And it's based in Sydney, but it's national. So that has a list of trauma-informed counsellors, psychologists.
Oh, good.
Yeah.
Good.
So, and the people here at Behaviour and BPD and so on, just on the information sheet, I'm surprised Blue Knot wasn't mentioned.
Is there a website for it?
BlueKnot.org, I think.
.org, okay.
It used to be adult survivors of child abuse.
Okay, yeah.
Yes, we should make sure that that's included, so thank
it's
you.
an excellent resource and great clinical guidelines and so on.
Good, thank you, good to know. And this is the other reason to network like this, because none of us know everything. It's so good to put our heads together. Now, talking of resources, the Family Connections program, I really hope that it takes off a bit more than it has, because it's a very good program. It has 3 parts, and I've actually got something here on each of the parts. The first one is, so basically they offer information and education and kind of cover a lot of ground in terms of information about BPD. This is for families and carers. The second thing they do is that they teach skills to families. And that's quite a new thing in Melbourne. It's been done for a long time in Europe and the United States and Canada, but not for a long time here, teaching skills to caring families, carers. The third thing they do is they have that informal part towards the end where people can get to know each other and get informal support from each other and learn that they're not alone and dealing with similar problems. So a big part, of course, can be about managing crisis and understanding self-harm. And a very big part, I think, should be talk about recovery, because people with BPD recover and get better over time, even without treatment. And we need to tell them that. We need to tell the family that. And we also need to tell them that with treatment, it's actually quicker. So we don't have to wait till till the person spontaneously matures through life experiences, because it can be a very long time. But with appropriate treatment, they can actually recover quicker. And the last point about diagnosis that I want to make is that I think we know so much about recovery now and so much about the good effects of appropriate treatment that no one should ever be given the diagnosis without mentioning that actually getting a diagnosis of BPD is a good prognosis diagnosis, as Rita has put it to me. And it's a good, quick way of saying it, that actually, and I have felt this way for a long time, of course you can never choose which mental illness you're going to have, if you're going to have one, but if I could choose, if I had to have one and I could choose, I would choose this, because you can get better. People do recover, yes.
Anna, could you talk a little bit more about understanding self-harm and managing crises?
Yeah. I think So it's important to understand that chronic self-harm, so it's important to distinguish between acute distress and maybe some self-harm that might go with that, and chronic self-harm, and different rules apply. Roughly, the rules are that with chronic self-harm, you give control over to the person to manage that and basically tolerate quite a lot of distress and maybe even blood around the self-harm, and not race to hospital with it and not do much about it, because it's a chronic situation that the person is doing and not showing any signs of wanting to work on it, perhaps. Whereas with acute distress, when maybe acute things come on top of the chronic, maybe there is some chronic distress about some general family situations, but then there is an acute situation, which is the person has just split up from her boyfriend, let's say, or maybe a parent has died, or a sibling has had a car accident or something. That would be an acute situation. It might be just simply an anniversary of something. So an anniversary is coming up. So when there's acute and chronic, and then if there is threat to self-harm or threat to suicide, you kind of really need to act. So the shorthand sort of professional expression for it, when there is acute on top of chronic, go into action. When it's chronic, the team needs to develop some understanding about how that chronic self-harm is handled, what are the responses that are useful and what are the responses that are not useful. For example, at the Northern, we had programs where people were able to reach out for help by either ringing the CAT team or their clinician before self-harm. And if they did that, even hospital was one of the strong considerations. After self-harm, no hospital, or maybe just one day to stitch everything together again. So it's important to, I mean, there are whole workshops. Spectrum does workshops on understanding self-harm. And the way I understand it is that it has lots of functions, but one of the main functions is regulating emotions. So people at a very young age, sometimes when they are 10 or 11, learn that self-harm helps to feel better. And if you learn that, you're going to do it if you're going to feel terrible like that for quite often. So, but it has other functions as well. It's also calming things for a lot of people. It's got physiological functions that fit into it as well. Does that answer your question for now, Julian? Yeah. Julian? Anything else? Anything else about self-harm or?
No, not so much about self-harm, but I know families find it very difficult to manage crises and often felt like they're left to do it. And
it's a very traumatic part.
And what can they expect of the professional, really? Like what would be good professional care?
Yeah. Well, good professional care would be a CAT team response, where the CAT team, meaning a crisis and assessment and treatment team, where the T hasn't dropped down of the picture. Because our CAT teams generally do crisis assessment, but treatment is not going to feature large in the CAT teams. So then, if the CAT team responds and maybe there's a hospitalization or maybe just emergency care, generally, my understanding is that for chronic self-harm, hospitalization is not useful. For a crisis in a person's life who has had trauma and now is having a crisis, for example, there's an anniversary coming up, it is useful to have a planned hospitalization. Sometimes people like to have a few days in hospital for a break. and that there is something to be said for that too. And then the service could decide, and together with the client and the carer sometimes, that how many days that should be per year, and then you economize those days in terms of planned admissions. That's much more useful than have a huge crisis with lots of blood in the emergency department and then having a hospitalization and lots of relief. That's not giving the right message to the person. But yeah, there is, for families, a lot of the trauma and stress comes from managing crisis. And again, if somebody can work with the family to understand the patterns of this, there may be 2 or 3 different patterns that their family member might have, so that when it's coming, they say, okay, it's pattern 1 or pattern A, there's nothing I need to do, I just get on with my life. If it's pattern B, maybe have a big talk or have a big family talk and see if maybe some self-harm or hospitalization can be averted. And if it's pattern C, head for the emergency department. If the family can understand, they have developed that kind of understanding, and there's that kind of predictability in the behavior, I mean, that's important too. It can be helpful. For DBT, dialectical behavior therapy, working to reduce self-harm is a #1 priority. So we think that self-harm is dangerous or potentially dangerous, and also people with trauma backgrounds have suffered enough, they don't need to hurt themselves even more. So we actually get people's commitment early on to work on self-harm and just work with them until they agree, because if they don't, it's really not DBT we're going to be doing, because DBT really targets it as a #1 priority, along with therapy interfering behaviors. So people stay in DBT because we address therapy interfering behaviors. And what are some of the other targets? Skill building, and developing dialectical thinking rather than stay with the black and white thinking. So the second part of the Family Connections program is learning new skills. And these new skills are basically on 2 sides of the scale. And I actually have a slide from another presentation which I inserted into this one. And so it's about what are the skills that people with the BPD need, but also families often need the same things. So families, let's concentrate on families. On one side are the acceptance strategies, listening, validating the family members' feelings, providing support, accepting them for the persons they are, or just simply being there, being around. And on this side, though, is the other side of the balance. Without this, the scale will overbalance in a way that's not going to work. With this, if the 2 balance each other out, there is a chance. And that the second part is, you can read for yourselves, all the change strategies. So again, I don't know if you ever have family members who ask you, I don't understand what I need to do. Do I just have to love her and accept her as she is? Or do I have to kick her out of home and kind of call it we need a break sort of thing in the family? And the truth lies somewhere in the middle. Actually, there is some need for listening and validation and support. And also, it can't be without limits, without boundaries. With limits, the most important thing to remember is that we should be identifying our own personal limits as professionals, like I can't do that, or I can't be there after 5, or whatever that limit is as a professional. For families, I don't give lifts anymore, or whatever. That's a boundary. I don't give lifts. Or I can help you find out on when the next bus is coming, but I can't give you lifts. That would be a boundary. And it's not like you're restricting to your family member, your son, for example, with BPD, but you're saying what you personally can and can't do. So with limit setting, it's much easier to think about it as our own limits. And it's much more acceptable to our family member too, because I'm talking about what I can't do. And I'm the only one who knows what I can't do. So that's good, that's more acceptable, and they don't feel so restricted. So that's the skills part, which can happen in groups, with family connections, for example, and it can be done one-to-one. For example, the listening and validation skills that we have done in groups here, Peter, with your fostering holistic help groups. We've done it in group settings. We broke up to small groups of 3 and practiced it. We can't do it today, unfortunately. I was hoping we will have time, but we haven't. And it can, but I do it all the time in private practice with families, family members who want to know, what is this validation thing? What if I disagree with what my son is talking about? How can I validate it? But you don't have to agree or disagree because we're looking for the feeling underneath what they're talking about. So we're not looking for the content, which way we might disagree with, because we wouldn't feel that way or we wouldn't do things that way. But if they're upset about something, we can still validate that I can see you're upset. That's validation. It's very, very simple. Simple, but not easy. Do you want to say any more about that?
I just was thinking, the key to that seems to me that if people validate each other all the time, it's just a natural human thing. But I think when we're under a lot of pressure and people are feeling blamed and guilty, it's harder to validate others. So I think we're families where these complex sort of issues are being played out, it's people, sort of start to stand their own ground and have difficulty. So I think for validation, it's actually something you have to sort of learn again, or in a sense. So yeah, and I think you're right. One of the best things of the groups that Anna helped me run was actually people sitting out and actually practicing validation skills. It sounds a little bit sort of childish, but in a way, there's no other way to do it. Practice with a friend, practice on each other. And it sounds a little bit clunky, but because it's like any new skill, you practice it and then it becomes more natural and comfortable.
But the main thing is to have a go, because if you have a go, and of course you can have a go with family members because they need validation.
Yeah, absolutely.
Incredibly, because they blame themselves, they're having a hard time. If you can validate something that they do that's obviously helpful and useful and a good thing, why not? And validate how they feel, all that anger and frustration, for example, that can only be a good thing. The common experience is that people think it's clunky and artificial, but when they try it, they can observe that their family member relaxes a little. There's a bit of relief with it. And hey, if you can have a bit of that, that's... No one is going to complain about that. So the group exercise would have been to have a go, to listening carefully and listen for the feeling rather than the content of the family member. And here's another skill, to stop and not react, because we often accuse our family members about reacting too much and not thinking, but we can do it too. And mindfulness is a great thing to learn for that. How to just take a little break from it all and become mindful of how we're feeling in the moment. The third part of the Family Connections program, which Rita mentioned, is this one, the support part, when people mingle, they try to understand each other, and they learn about all the groups and support services that have been mentioned here tonight. The message from all of that, you're not alone, because distressed families are often isolated and alone, even if they never were isolated and alone before the stresses started building up. And of course there's also that option of learning about professional services as well. And now here is our title. We've come full circle. We will finish any minute now. Strike while the iron is cool. How many of you have heard this in this way? Strike while the iron is cool. It's mentioned sometimes in trauma treatment circles because quite often there's nothing wrong with what the family is trying to do or achieve with the family member, except the timing. The timing is wrong. And if they're in a crisis, if they're in extreme distress or anger, whatever the family is trying to do is not going to work. They can't even hear what the family members are saying, let alone put it in practice. So we need to wait till the time when the iron is cool. And when there's a moment of stability, a moment of calm, and encourage family members to then do some things that they know are overdue. For example, start talking, start learning together something, start reaching out to that family member who maybe has been avoidant. So don't do it on a bad day, although sometimes it might go down well on a bad day too. Do it on a good day when you're less likely to be rejected. When we are cool and calm, family members can think about how they haven't been taking care of themselves and how they could perhaps take the first step today to start, do even just the smallest thing to start that. How to take a break. And something else that BPD families for short can learn is that if there are storms that are likely to come repeatedly, how to prepare themselves at a time when the iron is cool so they know how to handle the next storm rather than wait for the next storm and then react. Because reacting is the worst thing we can do in any situation. Children, we should have spent more time on children. We can't now, but just as I walked in here, I met the person whose name is Rose Cuff. Rose Cuff, that's right, who was instrumental in producing this brochure about information for children about, guess what, BPD. And lots of instructions about how to use this booklet as well. So now we can start including children in ways that you were never involved in, I suppose. Or were you? Did you have some support as a child?
No, family severely dysfunctional. The idea that the children had disorders wouldn't have even been considered. No. It's like, oh no, that's just such and such. They just
Yeah. And I come from the same walk of life you have, with my mum having had BPD type behaviours and personality, but never diagnosed, and I never had any benefit of this. Or even a book. This is the only book that Rita and I know for children of parents with BPD. And the title is Weather House, the Weather House. So things change like the weather, or maybe more. And it's Canadian, and apparently it's available, or maybe available if you look for it. So I put the information here about it. But there are now resources, and we now talk about child carers who need support, need information, and need to be able to reach out with, using things like Kids Helpline and things like that. For the teams you work in, it's really important to keep an eye on dependence and know who is keeping an eye on them if you can't do it. If it's not your role to do it, it's good to know who is doing that and liaise with that person. Looking for resources, of course, Google is always a good place to turn to, but also Spectrum. I know for a fact that the intake worker at Spectrum keeps tabs of psychiatrists, other professionals, clinics where people can go for various programs or various kinds of help. So they may not be able to provide that help, but they might know where else to turn.
Not enough numbers.
No, I mean, did you sure? I think it doesn't start with 9. I think it starts with 88.
Yeah, not.
Doesn't it?
It'll be on the website.
Sorry, we're running over time.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. So. I think it starts with 88, doesn't it?
8833
Yeah, that's it. 8833.
3050.
Okay, thank you. Yeah. So clinicians are always wondering what are effective treatments, which is more effective than the other. And I know that a very good study that found that there was no huge difference amongst these different approaches. It depends what the practitioner is good at and what suits the client. Yeah. I think we need to call it today. It's 8:10. We did start a bit late, but some of you were here in good time. Thank you very much for listening and participating and making tonight.